That was
Well,
great.
hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Um, my name's Gabrielle Resch McNally, and I'm just getting started here. Welcome to all of you streaming virtually to join us here today. I am the director of the Women for the Land. I'm the director for the Women for the Land program at American Farmland Trust, and I'm based here in Oregon on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples. Our program is really dedicated to working on behalf of greater equity in agriculture. We focus on supporting women farmers and those who identify as women and non-binary folks who are farmers, landowners, and aspiring farmers, and accessing resources to support their resilience and their success. I really want to thank you all for joining us in our free range conversation today. This is a live conversation. You'll have a chance to ask questions via social media. While we're getting started, I encourage you to use the comment or the chat field on whatever platform you're joining in on, and tell us where you're streaming from and what your connection to agriculture is. Are you a farmer? Are you a landowner? Are you an eater? Probably many of those things. I'm honored and privileged today to be talking to three amazing leaders in regenerative agriculture. I want to thank our whole team here at AFT and our project partners for their support in getting us to the stage. We've been talking about this event now for a little while, and I'm so glad that it's actually here. I want to emphasize my role here today as a facilitator of dialogue. I'm excited to be joined here by Liz Carlisle, who is a prolific author, a professor, and really what I would say a storyteller extraordinaire. We are also joined by Latrice who's a soil scientist, cultural science lead, and intern supervisor for the Regenerative Grazing Initiative at the Pecan Lodge Health Institute on the Blackfeet Nation. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Nikiko Masamoto, and she's an organic farmer, a memory keeper, and an artist. She works the same soil as her great-grandparents, worked in California on the Masamoto family farm. She grows organic nectarines, apricots, peaches, and grapes for raisins. I'm going to give each of these folks much more time to fully introduce themselves and share their stories. But before we get started, I just wanted to provide a little more context for why we're here on this live stream today. The live stream was inspired by Liz's somewhat recently published book, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. The book inspired so many ideas and reflections on the rich and deep and certainly complicated history of regenerative agriculture. Each of the guests here today are featured in the book in very powerful ways. I think both times I was brought to tears hearing parts of their family stories and their journeys. What struck me deeply from reading the book was the rich and layered knowledge system shared by each of the women farmers, scientists, land stewards who were featured in the book. At the end of the book, Liz writes, in quotes, "The vital work of rebuilding soil carbon is inextricably woven together with the vital work of racial justice." And what I might add to that is it's also inextricably connected to gender justice and gender equity as well. The book makes a case for a truly intersectional and relational effort that is needed to create a more resilient agricultural system, particularly in the face of climate disruption. So I want to thank you, Liz, for this book, and of course to Latrice and Nikiko for all your contributions and for taking time here today and all of the generative work that you're doing out in the world as parents, as scientists, as farmers, and as conversationalists here. So we're going to start with the first set of introductions. Before I do that, I just want to remind folks who are joining on social media, please put in questions. We will get to those a little bit later in our conversation. We want to know who here is joining us and what you're interested in asking these wonderful guests. So the first set of introductions, I'm going to kind of ask slightly different questions, and we'll kick things off with Liz, partly because she was her book was the instigation for this entire conversation and our launching point. So could you kind of kick us off, Liz, and share a little bit more about yourself and what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah. And first of all, I'll just say I'm so delighted to be here. And I'm just really like feeling the power of these three women around me. They're in a quadrant and now we're in a little stack, but it's just like seeping in. And I know also all of you joining us here virtually have your own incredible stories and histories with land as well. And it's just wonderful to be here for this dialogue. And where this book came from for me started actually really early in my life. My grandmother was a really important person in my life, and she lost a family farm in the experience of the Dust Bowl. But she had this experience of a really deep relationship with land as a young woman. Prior to that, losing that family farm during the Dust Bowl, and she's never lost that land connection. And in my view of her, as a child looking up to this wise elder in my family, it felt to me like that land connection was the source of so much of her groundedness and her wisdom. And to me, it seemed like she just knew so much about how to be a human. And then it came from that place. And so I wanted that kind of land connection for myself. And at the same time, she was really honest with me about that tragedy of the Dust Bowl, what it was like to, in a very short period of time, lose her home, her family's livelihood. She had to go live with another family and do chores to earn money to have clothes for high school. And it was like lives fell apart for so many people in the middle part of the country. And she said, my dad overplowed. He got bad advice from the U.S. government advisors, and we as a family had relatively recently migrated from Europe. There'd been these railroad advertisements that said, come have a farm, and so over the course of growing into a young adult, I was sort of untangling. What is settler colonialism? Why was my family there? Why did they get such bad instructions about how to care for land? And if I'm going to have a land connection, how can that be part of a process of repair so that people can have longstanding land connections and we don't keep repeating these extractive histories? So it's been about a dozen years now that I've had this privilege of speaking with farmers, regenerative farmers, organic farmers, sustainable farmers about their incredible land care wisdom. And over that period of time, it's become clearer and clearer to me that this process of extraction that I'm so concerned about and that was so disruptive to my own family's history is so deeply intertwined with colonization, and that really that extraction of carbon from those prairies, that was part of a larger process of colonization that also involved extraction of people from those lands and extraction of labor from people's bodies. And so the process of repair really needs to repair all of that. Luckily, a white author and professor like me doesn't have to start from scratch here. I can just start listening a little bit more to Indigenous communities and communities of color who have been talking about this for hundreds of years, about the need to change relationships with land and with each other such that they're not so extractive. And so they are reciprocal. And so it's just been an incredible privilege to speak with the folks that I got to know better through this book process. And I'm delighted that all of you get to hear directly from Latrice and Nikiko today.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. So I'll pass it to Nikiko and Latrice, and I'll just ask you to share a little bit about your homelands, about the land that you work, the people that you work it with, whatever history and connections you want to tie in. I know it could be a long story, but share us a little bit about what connects you to this work. And maybe I'll pass it to Nikiko because the baby is still sleeping, perhaps, first.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Yes, I'm a new parent and juggling childcare today. So I'm blessed that my daughter Nunziata is giving me some quiet right now. So we are on the Masamoto family farm. That's a picture of me shaking raisins from a couple years ago. So I'll ground us in the landscape here. Our soil is sandy loam, which means when it's dry, and we've been in several basically a decade of a mega drought here in California, the soil is very light tan when it's dry, and then we've had these wild storms just these past couple weeks here in California. So right now it's like a dark chocolate brown. Our farm is fed by the waters of the Kings River, and these waters used to feed the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, the Tulare Lake, which was home to the Tachi people. And so it's important to me to note that. So this place that I call home, that I love, and the fruit that we grow is, I loved your word, Liz. You used the word entangled, and entangled with these histories of colonialism. There's now no more Tulare Lake because the river was dammed in the early 1900s. And at the same time, the reality is without damming the river, our farm wouldn't exist. So it's this push and pull, this tension between marking where we are and the places we love, and the people we love, with these complex histories that are marked by dominance, are marked by taking away of things. And at the same time, this place and my entry to this farm as a Yonsei, that's fourth generation Japanese American, is absolutely through a beautiful story of claiming a place to belong. This particular land where I'm seated, I'm in the house my grandparents built, actually in the room where my Ji-chan, my grandfather, passed away 13 years ago. And his presence as an ancestor is a blessing in my life. And he was the one who, after just 3 years after being imprisoned with 120,000 of our community, Japanese Americans from the West Coast, he decided to come back to California and start a farm. And he literally used dynamite to break apart hard pan, which is this compressed soil that is so hard roots can't penetrate. The only land he could afford was 40 acres of cheap land that was unfarmable. So with his bare hands, he used dynamite and brick by brick hauled out this rock so that he could plant roots for our family, and so that we could feed not only ourselves, but everyone. So that's the legacy that I am honored to be part of. And I hope whenever anybody here gets to touch the soil, that you get to pause with the people you love that brought you there. And particularly for us, we grow stone fruit and grapes for raisins. So we're fruit people. And when you get to bite into a juicy, juicy peach, I hope you feel loved. That's my orientation to what I do. And I'm so honored to be here with Latrice, who I've shared the pages of Liz's book with, and so glad to be here in real time. Latrice, tell us about your home place and the places you love.
Thank you, Nikiko. So I'm on our traditional homelands on the Blackfeet Nation and the Piikani territory, up along the Rocky Mountain front and the foothills, and that goes down into the plains. And so I'm very fortunate. We call the Rocky Mountain front the backbone to Mother Earth. We refer to her as Mother and understand our relationship and our role as caretakers for our mother and being a steward for our mother. And so having that relationship and understanding the value to our resources, if it comes back, for me, it goes back generations, and understanding that the land in which I ranch with my family, the land in which I work with my children, is the land that our family made sacrifices for. And what I mean sacrifices is times when our people were facing starvation, our time when our people were, the buffalo was being taken away and they were forced to more agrarian practices, that they were taking these on and making these sacrifices so they could maintain the land and maintain their homelands. And a lot of the times they had to go without things. And my dad always tells me, you guys are so fortunate. I remember, well, they had to sell their cow herd, and he said he was a young kid and he remembers his dad keeping like 3, 4 young calves, and just watching his heart broke as he watched the family herd dwindle down. And to this day, that still sticks with me, that those 4 calves, cattle calves, are what kept us going today as a family, and our ranch going today in the lands that I maintain. And so knowing the sacrifices that you have to make in keeping those cultural relationships, and understanding the teepee rings that my dad brought me to when I was a kid, the buffalo jumps that he brought me to where we live, and I was trotting on back of a horse, knowing that I had a deep rooted cultural connection to the land, as well as my agrarian background to sustain what we're doing, and looking at it as a way where I'd always tell my grandmother, like, "See where your cows are, grandma? Like, one day I'm gonna have buffalo there." And always knowing in my heart that I wanted to return these animals to the landscape, because they were always talked about in the past tense. And so now I always wanted them to be talked about in the present, especially on my landscape and where we have our cattle ranch. And so full circle, for us, it was the sacrifices to maintain the lands that we're on today, and knowing that my grandmother raising 10 children, putting them through school, and having her spouse pass away at a young age, those sacrifices are the reason I'm still there. So I always think those strong, determined people to say we are not leaving this land, and I get to raise my children there.
Oh, I'm going to take a deep breath because, I'm very moved by everyone's story here, and I want to just give praise to all these ancestors who are here with us today. I feel a little choked up as well. That's how I feel. I always get a lot of heart. I feel a lot of heart, and I know the audience here who's joining us on the live stream is feeling it as well. Thank you all for sharing such truth. And I got to say, that's what I felt when I was reading the book. Many moments where I felt really deeply connected to the stories. And what a gift. So thank you, Liz, and for each of you for sharing in such a deep and heartfelt way, and for honoring our family who's here today and the family who came before us. All right, I'll take a deep breath. I'll remind myself I'm on social media right now. Again, folks, drop in your questions. We'll be taking audience questions in a moment. And I'll just note that Nikiko has a small baby at home with her today, and so she might be popping in and out dealing with that little cutie. So my next question is kind of at the heart of, it's a huge question, and we'll see where we get with it, but it's really at the heart of kind of where I set things up for the start of the conversation, is really about this tie-in with regenerative agriculture and racial and gender justice. So I'd love, maybe we'll start again with you, Liz, to kind of help us understand how we, especially folks who maybe haven't heard those intersections as much before, how do we understand sort of these deep roots of regenerative agriculture and how they are fundamentally interconnected with racial justice and justice of in many forms? And welcome.
Yes. I mean, I'm glad you brought up that word roots, Gabrielle, because I think that's been a really key heart for me in these conversations of understanding these connections. When I started, I wanted to look into these connections between climate change and agriculture, and I'd heard a lot of claims about the way in which regenerative agricultural practices could store carbon and make a real difference in the climate fight. But there were really different opinions around me in terms of folks in the scientific community or researchers or practitioners, these really wide spectra of estimates of how much of a difference that regenerative agriculture could make in climate. And so I kind of started this book project looking at the soil science around regenerative agricultural practices and carbon sequestration. And one of the first things that folks in the scientific community started telling me about where their science was converging was really the importance of roots and keeping roots in the ground all year round. One thing that really sticks with me is this statistic from a synthesis paper, from a review paper, that made the point that carbon that is secreted by roots in the partnerships between plants and microbes is 5 times more likely to be stabilized below ground and actually sequestered than above ground carbon. And so increasingly, folks in the research community around regenerative agriculture are thinking about how do we keep roots in the ground all year round? There's a lot of discussion about more perennial farming systems. And yet, as I'm thinking about the history of agriculture in this country, that is a history of uprooting people, uprooting indigenous peoples, uprooting people from other parts of the world and bringing them to this part of the world to labor in agriculture as enslaved people, as underpaid immigrant workers, histories of really blatant discrimination and racism that uprooted people yet again, like the story that Nikiko was telling us about her grandparents being incarcerated for absolutely no good reason. They were of Japanese descent. And so how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile a history of continuous uprooting of people with the need to have deep-rooted agricultures in order for us to have a climate balance? And so that was a real signal to me that we need to deal really squarely with these histories of colonization and their legacies if we are, in fact, in these very practical ways, going to solve the climate problems with our agricultural system. And, then the other thing as I started doing more research is seeing that all of the regenerative agriculture techniques that I had learned about from farmers in that community over the past dozen years or so have really deep roots in indigenous communities and communities of color. So, the regenerative grazing that Latrice was just describing to you about a whole community of people that has this deep relationship with buffalo and prairie and using fire as a tool, that way precedes the conversation that's been happening more recently in ranching communities about how cattle could be rotated in ways that mimic bison. Like, that's a very long-standing insight within Latrice's community and that relationship with that animal as a teacher. And then, when you think about like nutrient cycling practices that are often a piece of the conversation of how do we put carbon back in the soil, cover crops, living mulches, composting, those practices have thousands-year-old histories in Asia. And many of the books that inspired the organic farming movement were by people who came from the US or Europe, went and saw traditional Asian farming systems and wrote about what they learned. And there's tons of other examples from agroforestry throughout the African diaspora and polyculture throughout the Americas. But these practices have really deep roots in indigenous communities and communities of color. And they've also been used as tools of resistance in the face of extraction and colonization. So they're continually being refined. We're not talking about a historical artifact of practices that were used thousands of years ago, but practices that have been continually really, really important in these struggles that are both ecological and social at the same time.
Nikiko or Latrice, how do you respond? What are those intersections for you in terms of the practices and the work of, if you put the label of regenerative, resilient agriculture and these issues of justice, how are you kind of approaching those intersections?
For me, I look at it as relationship based because we have a responsibility to care for the land. And when you look at things in a relationship base, then you think about I can't even think of that word right now, I think. But the sharing,
Reciprocity.
reciprocity, there we go. That was the one. It was like it's at the tip of my tongue and it's not coming. But when you think of things in that nature, in the balances that we had in those systems and in the cultural lessons and integrity in those teachings, and for ours, we were nowhere above the animals, nowhere below the animals. Were we were all beings living on this land, and we had a role. And so for me, it's taking that relationship back and applying it to what our people have told us and finding ways to relate that in a way that I could use it in the practices that we're using today, and looking at how moving cattle and having more abundant and diversity in the grasslands is helping take carbon out of the soil and really pushing that, because right now we deal with bigger issues that hold our people back from being able to take those practices on. And so a lot of it is not having the resources for infrastructure and all these things that most other producers in our area who are of non-color have had plenty of opportunity and hands in the pot to get the infrastructure needs that they want to have these practices. So working where we're starting at, ground zero, and really getting our people the infrastructure that they need to take these practices on and relating it in a way that is relationship based in the responsibility that we have to maintain the land, because our ancestors were the caretakers of the lands before us, and we need to take care of the lands for the generations after us. So I always talk about, the management that my great grandfather made, I'm the benefactor for. And so the decisions that my grandmother made, my children are the benefactor for. And so it just goes on and on. So the decisions that my dad makes and the decisions that I make on our operation, those will benefit them, or they will have the effects, and however you want to look at it, because I always say what we're living in now is based on the decision makers generations before us, and so they didn't always make the best decisions for the land, and now we're living in those effects. So how do we go back and look at what we need to do? And it's looking at the people who were on the lands and had those relationships, and what were they doing at the time? And so for me, it's looking back to what my people were doing and what the bison's relationship on the land was. And so, looking at that and working with our ranchers and our operators and meeting them where they're at, and not trying to say, this is what I want you to do and this is why, but it's understanding that we're building a relationship, and then once we build a relationship with our producers, then we're able to help our producers, because it's that trust factor and knowing that we're there for them and want to see them be successful, because when they're taking care of their land, they're having healthier soil. When you have healthier soil, you have healthier plants. When you have healthier plants, you have healthier animals. When you have healthier animals, your people are healthier, they're consuming healthier food. And I think about that on all aspects, whether it's in, what Nikiko does, her fruit and all that. And so I always think about the diversity on the landscape, not only animals, but the diversity of plants and what that does, uptaking, because they all have different roles and different growing seasons. And so for me, when I'm on the land with my producers, I just take all those things into account. But I first realized that in order to make effective change, I need to hear them, and they need to know that I am there for them and I care what they're going through, because if they don't feel that support, how are they going to trust me to make these changes? And so I feel like we're in a society where we forgot about the importance of relationships, and we need to factor those in and understand that we have to have those healthy relationships, whether it's with each other, our animals, the land, the plants, the soil. But that's how we are really going to sustain ourselves, because it's that caretaking, that our role and responsibility for Mother Earth. So now I'll go to Nikiko.
I just want to pause for a second. Latrice, what you're articulating is so profound, like relational ways of existence. And what it's kind of bringing up for me is, um, you know, what you're articulating about an orientation to life in circular, reciprocity, like circular, and what you're articulating about relationships between beings, between plants and beings, between people, that never ends, right? Like I think part of Western culture wants us to think in linearity, right? Like checking things off the list, and living relationally is never ending. And we don't want it to be ever ending. And I do think that this is in our the urgency of our time of how do we address climate change? How do we address pollution? How do we address the need for reparations for so many communities who have been forced off of land? There is urgency, and yet what Latrice is beautifully articulating is an answer that is unending, that goes on and on and on. It's not a checklist. And I just love this so much because when Liz was talking with me before Hailing Grounds came out, I think one of our conversations was, I'm not so sure how important to me the word regenerative agriculture is, because as Latrice has beautifully shared, her people have been doing this way before English arrived at this continent, right? And my people from both Japan and also I have European roots have been living in places with animals and plants and beings for thousands and thousands of years before the term. And so I just share this because I think sometimes in our current state of a crisis, there's a impulse to want to create a checklist of solutions. And I completely agree with Latrice. My orientation to regenerative agriculture, in quotes, is what are the questions and the practices that we want to live with forever? And those are the things that keep me up at night, both with wild dreams and also with nightmares about what I'm worried about, right? Like, so worried about. So I so appreciate this. I think a lot about of love and land, and love. Relationships of love are not all sweet. They are sweet, but profound love is about vulnerability. It's about accepting our flaws. It's about working through tough times. And I desperately want more people to fall in love with land in a healthy way that is not about ownership, but it's about coming to see the blossoms and realizing I might only have 40 more years of blossoms left in my life if I'm lucky. That's it. Bloom happens once a year. So what are the things that we can adjust in our life to live around the cycles of nature that invite us into deeper relationships, as Latrice is sharing and asking us to do? So I'll pause there. I'm just like totally jazzed to be in this space with Latrice and just like, all right, let's do it. Reciprocal relationships forever. I'm in.
Nikiko, I love that, and I know folks have seen some of the ways you can connect with these lovely people, and I know is blossom. I think you call it bathing or blossom. You can go out to the orchards if you're near Nikiko's family farm and bathe in the blossoms, which sounds lovely to me right in this moment. But I think what we've all spoken about here kind of connects to a few of the really more comments that have come across. And I'll just remind folks we're having a live conversation. I see some beautiful comments, folks sharing where they're from, how they're connected to agriculture. We'll look to connect with all of you in one way or another, but thank you for asking questions and making comments. But there have been a few questions around sort of this land piece, around folks wanting to be engaged in agriculture, but struggling to connect to land. We know land is so expensive. And as Liz and each of you point out in your stories, there's so much dispossession that's happened on land in the US in terms of who owns it. 98% of farmland in the US is owned by white folks. And that is by design through the histories that Liz pointed out, and each of your stories sort of shares deeply. And women are growing in terms of our land ownership in parts of the country. It's up to 50%. But a lot of that is sort of non-operating land ownership in larger row crop production systems where that land is still managed or kind of outsourced. So we know there's a challenge with land, and it's not an easy challenge. And I don't know if any of you are prepared for this question, but because it's coming up, I'd love to know, there are more creative ways to think about cooperative land holding, ways to think about rematriation or land back. these are all conversations that folks are having in different places. So I just love for folks to reflect on what to do about the issue of land, since we know many people want to connect to the land and they want a piece of their own land, but maybe feel they can't access that for a myriad of reasons. What are some tools or things that you think those folks should be thinking about? I'll let whoever has a deep response who wants to jump in. Or not deep, but whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in first, because I did, as I was working on Healing Grounds and I was speaking to all these incredible regenerative agriculture leaders from all these indigenous communities and communities of color, this issue around land kept coming up, and this really deep connection between land justice and the possibility of an agriculture that is regenerative. So I ended up sort of landing the book there. The concluding chapter is really about how do we get to land justice? What does that word even mean? And what are some efforts that are ongoing? And so there's some brief profiles in the final chapter of a couple of organizations that are working on it in different parts of the country. Minnow, which is working on this in California and is really interested in synergy between rematriation for Indigenous communities and also reparation for farmers of color for their unpaid labor, and finding ways to build cooperative relationships on land, but also towards more than just acquiring land and transferring ownership, which is one piece of Minnow's work, also moving towards rebuilding the kinds of relationships with land that Latrice and Nikiko have both been talking about as a relative rather than as a commodity. And so, a very ambitious and I think critical vision for where land justice needs to go, that the redistribution is very important and access is very important. And also these commoditized relationships to land are part of colonization, and those relationships have been imposed. And so beyond the transfer and the access, it's also about people being able to relate to land in ways that are culturally appropriate and are consistent with their own values and teachings. And then the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is working in the Northeast and doing similarly informed work, thinking about those synergies between access to land for farmers of color and rematriation and access for Indigenous communities. And I've since learned that there are also many other groups working on this, and incredible coalitions, not just in the United States, but around the world. And then there's ongoing really amazing work that's been spearheaded by Native communities, including hanging on to land that folks already have and gaining more sovereignty and rights over that land, as well as reclaiming territory. So I think so much of this work is collective. There are things that individuals can do who are, really wanting access to land. But I think the big work is really collective for our whole society in moving towards land justice and shifting our relationship to land. There are some really exciting things. I mean, I could talk about some of the legislation Cory Booker has sponsored, marker bills for the Farm Bill that really are about land grants for farmers of color. I was super excited to see Deb Haaland's announcement just a few days ago about Inflation Reduction Act funding for bison restoration and the bigger vision that that's part of. So I think there are some existing policy vehicles, but I do think we need to think ambitiously as a whole society and collectively about how to get where we need to go.
I guess one thing that comes to mind for me, even being on the Blackfeet Nation, is just how fractionated the reservation is, and looking at how, having the resources to purchase the land, the segmented land back, because through there's so many shareholders on so many pieces, and that it make it hard for any individual to do anything on that piece of property, because you could have 400 acres, but you could have 4,000 shareholders, and you need 51% to do anything on that property. So you'd need over 2,000 and some sign off on that. And so that was really becoming an issue, and how people were going to even have access to that land, where their family had been since the Allotment Act, in having those resources. And so, understanding how the fractionation of lands really disproportionately affected our people, and given the fact that a lot of the times they couldn't produce anything off the land because it was so cold, and you can't farm up here when it's -40 with a negative, and then the wind chills, like, has you in the 50s and -60s. And so looking at that, and people were having to sell their land, and writing them off at the corner stores, and getting enough milk, bread, eggs, and sugar to feed their family, but not fully realizing that they were losing their rights to that land and the title. And so now what we're facing is getting even the lands back on the Blackfeet Nation, and to try to get into more single ownership. And so that has been an issue when we're looking at ranching and farming, and access for our producers. And even as that, where we live, we're at the headwaters, Glacier National Park, and a lot of the land is privatized. So a lot of people, a lot of my interns who I take on in the summer, haven't been to a lot of the lands that we go to when we are working with our producers. And so for them, being on these internships that we provide in the summer provides them access to their own homelands, where they're like, I didn't know this lake was here. Oh my gosh, like this spring is so clear. And they're digging the soil, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's this soil so dark and rich. And when we're down further east, it's more gray. And so, just understanding how the moisture affects the soil development from the mountains to the foothills and to the plains, for them, just being out there and have that access to the internships, but looking at the larger level. So, we look at all those inadequacies when we're working with our producers, and trying to find ways to adjust them, because it affects what a lot of the problems we're facing today is those injustices. And we're just working at it with what, the government was like, here, this is your reservation, but we still have our traditional territories past what is marked as our reservation. And so then you still know that you still have responsibilities to those lands and the people who live on them. And so you want to say, hey, let me share my knowledge from this area, and when our people were down there. And because you that's that transfer of knowledge. You want them to know, you're there for them, because they're taking care of something that ultimately your people took care of and fostered. And so it's not wanting to hold that information, but it's to share. And in our medicine wheel, and many tribes have them, there's different quadrants, and ours represents in those 4 quadrants the different of for people, and they're, and so then it takes into where we're still in this circle. Even though we're broke down into these smaller categories, we're still this one, living on this one. And so understanding that diversity has been a part of our world, and understanding that, looking at that and honing those different views, as we make each other stronger, because we're reaching out to others who have other viewpoints and understandings of the world around them. So for me, that the injustice is, not just looking at things from one side, but reaching out to those people, and valuing that information that they're sharing with you, because the information they're sharing has been sustained, for what our people like to say, from time immemorial, because that predates anything. Our relationships to the land predate anything that has been written. And so that's how we really look at it, is just putting that back out there.
That's so beautiful, Latrice. Thank you for sharing. I'm hearing like all kinds of creative ways of engaging with land, working through um, the private land ownership that does exist to give access to youth, but then also raising up these problems with the ways in which land ownership was structured, specifically to disempower people of color and indigenous people. I just want to echo that. I hear that. I don't have any like individual solutions. I think we're going to need as many solutions as possible, whether it's helping indigenous and farmers of color who do own land stay, keep their land, whether it's talking with the 98% of landowners who are white in this country and engaging in really deep conversations about what would it look like to give land to all kinds of structures, nonprofits, co-ops, universities, in a path of healing, because of course our university system are also based in colonialism and taking of land, right? So there's so much healing that needs to happen. I have like a dream of like, what would it look like to have a national, like something that was like a national park system, but for farming and ranching, that where we, the people, owned the land and we, the people, could have access. I mean, I would just imagine like, what would the Yosemite of a beginning farmer public land look like? Wouldn't that be like so amazing? Just like, just public low cost entry where people could learn how to farm. So I just share that I think we're going to need all strategies. It's going to be messy. It's going to take a long time, and we're going to have to work through public, private, nonprofit, co-op, all these different models we're going to need to exercise as we move towards the direction of, hopefully, in my opinion, no ownership, because that's an imposition, right? The earth is, and I don't know if you can hear my daughter screaming. She wants her voice heard. She cares also. So I will pause here.
Thank you, each of you. And Nikiko, one of the things that also kind of comes to mind in what you're sharing, and a little bit about kind of your journey of going back to the family farm in the book, reflecting on like, this is where I can do this important work, is reconnecting. And I think there are some folks who that is a proposition, for the folks who do have land and their families reconnecting to that land. We do a lot of work in the Southeast, predominantly with Black women farmers, and some of them still have land that's been in the family, and they're trying to find their way back to the land and keep it in their family. And I think there is something really powerful there. And certainly there are organizations trying to support transition situations to encourage folks to think, even within the familial line, especially when it comes to women, getting women in the generation to get access to that land in the family, but also to keep land, in the family, to address things like heirs property, which is another fractionated land ownership situation that deeply affects people, especially in the South. And so just thinking about all these ways, but that kind of that generation, for those of you who are listening, who have those family ties to land, there's a gift and an opportunity there, both for your family, but I think as each of you are sharing, to like share that beyond your family, there's an opportunity for that land to be an asset that's not just for an individual unit of family. So I think that's super exciting. I know we're kind of getting towards the end. We've had lovely comments and questions. I think, there's some great stuff that, again, some folks, if you ask really specific questions that we don't get to, I see a number of our staff responding about specific resources related to water. But one of the, I thought maybe I would sort of put up a question. It's more of a comment, but I think it's a really nice thing to kind of reflect in as we're starting to wrap up the conversation. This is with Sam, but it's about sort of hearing these stories. This regenerative movement requires intellectual and emotional connection, commitment, and understanding, which I think is profound in my perspective. And he's saying that the language used here might be different than that of the Iowa farmers he met with this week, but all farming communities have so much in common. And I love this because it is in this time where we're like quite fractionated as an American community, if we can see ourselves that way, or sharing this land or not sharing this land. There's so much that's dividing us. But I've always felt like agriculture, food, the soil, the land is a way to reconnect, as Latrice so beautifully talked about those relationships. So I just love to hear from all of you, like, how are we using, how can we kind of use this space of agriculture, food systems, land, soil, like, is that a place for us to build connections with one another, particularly perhaps across language divides, whether that's like actual different languages or it's different cultural perspectives. So I'd love to hear how we build those bridges and make those connections with one another.
I think something that comes to mind is just knowing that inherently we all come from a cultural background. And no matter where our cultural background comes from, we're all rooted in this deep knowledge base. And so who we are reaching out to, whether it's a native community and the language is different, but understanding these perspectives and we need land, we need agriculture, and to sustain the sustainability of it is ultimately is going to sustain our populations into the future. And so when you talk about agriculture, I feel like it's universal because everywhere you go, there's a relationship they have to the land and food that they're growing and things that are sustaining. And so, I don't know the proper language, but when you connect with someone and you're talking about connecting to the land, whether you're using these technical Western terms or using terms that are with the identity of the land and the language that's with the identity of the land, and understanding that yes, there were people there before you. What were they doing with the land? What were they growing? Were they was it polycultures, monocultures, and those things. And so when you really look what the relationship was and looking at those stories, sometimes when you when I visit with non native producers, their stories go back and you ask a question and they're going to tell you a whole story about why that is the way that is. And that's the same in native culture. And it's hearing those stories because those stories are what connected them to the land. And we all make mistakes when it comes to learning things, trial and error. I'm still learning things as a rancher, and now bringing buffalo back to our ranch with just 3 young animals. And so I feel like you're constantly learning and sharing, and I share a lot with my non-native friends who are in ranching, and we share ideas, and I think having that open mindedness to hear these different perspectives, because if you go in closed-minded and oh that's not how we think, then you're already shutting yourself off to what could be. And so I always try to be really open-minded, and I always when I went with Liz and we were in Monterey, California, I was looking at the fisheries, and for me, they were talking about, when the Dust Bowl was happening, everybody was moving from the east to the west, and so then there was all these Dust Bowl stories, where these fisheries were, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, so they just did extractive agriculture to the land, and now they're doing extractive, fishing, and, they're facing the same problem with these fisheries that we're facing with the land." And so, hearing those hard things of like, okay, what we were doing then necessarily wasn't best. But and so going back to what those previous relationships were with, the indigenous communities, because if you wipe those away and say, well, that's not applicable now because we're in this different age of farming, and how do those views and idealisms have anything to do with what we're going to do, then you're defeating yourself yet again. And the thing of the beauty of the world is we come from diversity and we are all here to share and learn from one another. So I just take that into consideration, is knowing that agriculture is the way we all connect, because we all need the land, we all need to eat, we all need clothes, and everything that we get to sustain ourselves is from agriculture. And different people have different terms for it, but it all comes back to the land and to the earth. So that's, for me, my common language.
So beautiful. I mean, Latrice says it all. Latrice is asking us to ask for each other's stories. Like how beautiful. 100%. And in the listening, that's where the relationship is seated, right? And germinating. And yeah, I really resonate. Latrice, you said, that it doesn't matter so much if we're using technical terms or not. and one of the things I try to remind myself when I'm particularly out to do change work, meaning trying to build bridges with people whose survival is linked with mine, but maybe whose relationship with me is a little fractured. It doesn't matter if I'm using the terms that I like. What matters is what understanding is being built. Would I approach a baby boomer white cisgendered neighbor and ask if he was a feminist? No, I would ask, tell me about your grandmother. Did your grandmother work this land? What did you learn from your grandmother? And from there, build up towards the justice demands that we do need to ask for, which is change. But I don't, if there's one thing that I've learned in my time back here in the Central Valley, it's I don't start at like 100 miles per hour. I start with ask the question. And that doesn't mean there aren't moments for demand where demand is sharper. There are moments for that, but it doesn't have to be the singular strategy for us to make change. And I mean, Latrice just said it much more beautifully than I. We need all the strategy, right? When we really take diversity not as a check mark term, but as an actual, like, living in the fullness of who we are as a planetary we. At least that's my definition of diversity, like the fullness of who we really are. That starts with stories, listening and telling.
Yes. I have absolutely nothing to add to that brilliance. But I'm going to take those instructions.
Well, I want to thank you all. Like, what a beautiful note to end on, at least, or to begin upon, to continue forth on. We have much work to do, but what a lovely conversation. And I do love, you see that sort of NRCS definition of diversity and kind of soil resilience, and diversity is such a big piece of it. And I love how you so beautifully sort of carved that out, Latrice, as this sort of much broader space of this entirety of diversity that we need. And then that there is a place for all of us who are at least earnest in working together and like who want the same things, which I'm hopeful that's many more people than it is not. So I really appreciate each of you. Thank you for taking the time. Thanks for everyone who joined. These videos will actually be posted online, so they'll live forever in the internet space, and you can share them. We'll do our best to follow up with folks. I think we've adequately shared everyone's contact information, but feel free to reach out to us at American Farmland Trust, and we'll connect you to any of these lovely folks. And there is a 30% discount for those of you who want to capture this book. I would recommend reading. It's a lovely, lovely book, and it has so many beautiful stories. So thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.